The reunion Edward never thought would happen. Evelyn, the woman he lost to his own ambition, returns, pregnant and more resilient than ever. Now, he must face the weight of his choices as a past full of lies and twists threatens to unravel the millionaire who built his life on wealth but lost what truly mattered: genuine love. Edward Langston seemed like the kind of man who had it all. The world knew him as a brilliant architect whose luxurious designs transformed urban landscapes into masterpieces. Living in his spacious penthouse, with windows framing the skyline like living portraits, he was a millionaire who appeared to have achieved everything money could buy. But at night, when silence took over, the truth emerged, a gnawing emptiness, born of the end of his marriage to Evelyn, his ex-wife. His penthouse felt like a gilded cage. Every corner of the apartment echoed the decisions that had driven Evelyn away, the one person who had believed in him before his life-changing successes. Among blueprints and contracts, he had lost the only person who truly mattered. Now, solitude was his only companion as he tried to convince himself that everything had been worth it. The past was a constant visitor in Edward's mind. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape memories of Evelyn, her laughter, her careful hands tending to the tiny garden they had once shared in their old apartment. Sometimes, the smell of freshly brewed coffee transported him back to simpler days when wealth and power were not the center of his universe. He knew he had failed her, but admitting it aloud was still too much to bear. At social events, Edward wore his usual mask, a polished and confident smile, the celebrated architect. But the truth was he was exhausted. Those glamorous gatherings, full of hollow congratulations and wealth-fueled happiness, only reminded him of how much he had sacrificed to reach the top. Claire, his current partner, was part of this charade. She loved the status that came with being with him, but Edward knew she would never understand the man he truly was. Richard, his old mentor, often said that the best structures are built on solid foundations. Ironically, Edward's own foundation was crumbling. He would stare at the models on his desk and realize that even at the height of his creativity, something was missing. Evelyn was that missing piece, and he knew it, even if he could never admit it out loud. One night, as he gazed at the city lights, Edward felt an unbearable weight pressing down on him. It was as if every glowing light was a reminder of all he had left behind: Evelyn, the baby he had never known, and the simplicity of a home where he was loved for who he was, not for what he could offer. He knew something had to change but had no idea where to begin. Edward wondered if it was too late to try to fix the past. The fear that Evelyn had erased him entirely from her life held him back. He tried to focus on work, on the next big project, but the feeling that he was running out of time was impossible to ignore. Deep down, he felt that a turning point was approaching. Everything in his life seemed to be made of appearances: the money, the accolades, even the smiles. But when the facade fell, he was just a man unsure if he deserved forgiveness. Edward questioned whether he even had the right to seek Evelyn out, to know how she was, to find out if the baby, his baby, was okay. Then, one morning, he received an invitation. The grand opening of one of the most luxurious hotels he had ever designed. An event meant to celebrate his genius, but one that would mark the beginning of something much greater. Little did he know, the past was not as distant as he had convinced himself it was. The hotel's grand opening was a spectacle of opulence, worthy of Edward Langston's reputation. Crystal chandeliers sparkled against marble walls, and elegantly dressed guests mingled over cocktails and speeches. As always, Edward was the center of attention. But something was different that night. Amid the pristine floral arrangements and rehearsed smiles, a detail caught his eye: Evelyn. She was there, quietly tending to the flowers on a side table. For a moment, Edward felt the ground disappear beneath him. Time seemed to freeze as he watched Evelyn from a distance. She was pregnant, visibly tired, but carried an air of strength he had never noticed before. Something about the way she arranged the flowers, with care and precision, hit him like a wave. He wasn't sure if it was the memory of the past or the shock of the present, but seeing Evelyn at that moment shook him to his core. Evelyn seemed unaware of Edward's presence, or perhaps she was pretending. She moved gracefully, as if carrying life inside her had given her a new sense of purpose. Edward couldn't look away. It was as though a window to his past had opened, but instead of memories, it brought questions he wasn't ready to answer. What was she doing there? Who was the baby's father? And most of all, how had she found the strength to stand there after everything he put her through? As Edward tried to regain his composure, Claire, his current partner, noticed his distraction. With a tight smile, she whispered something about important guests waiting for him. But her voice felt distant. He was trapped in the moment, unable to ignore the impact of seeing Evelyn. At an event meant to celebrate his greatest project, she was a reminder of everything he had lost in pursuit of success. The night wore on, and for the first time in years, Edward felt a vulnerability he couldn't suppress. He knew he had to maintain his composure, but Evelyn was a shadow of the past that refused to fade. He saw her finish adjusting the flowers and retreat to a quieter area. A part of him begged to follow, but logic held him back. After all, wasn't the past meant to stay buried? Every fiber of his being felt torn between reason and emotion. Edward knew the encounter was no coincidence. Something bigger was at play, something he couldn't simply ignore. But fear paralyzed him. What if she didn't want to see him? What if that baby was a living reminder that he was incapable of offering more than empty promises and suffocating love? As he watched Evelyn leave the main hall, Edward felt a growing sense of anguish. He had spent years building concrete and steel empires, but now he stood before something he couldn't control or design. It was Evelyn carrying new life, while he remained a prisoner of a past that haunted him. Deep down, he knew this moment wasn't the end of the story but the beginning of something that would change his life forever. Edward spent the following days trying to rationalize what had happened. He told himself repeatedly that the past was buried and that reopening old wounds made no sense. Evelyn seemed so distant, so detached from the life they once shared. Perhaps it was better to leave things as they were. After all, he had made his choices, built his career, and was on a path he couldn't afford to deviate from. Deep down, he convinced himself that she had moved on as well. But the questions lingered, throbbing in his mind like an unhealed wound. Who was the baby's father? How had she managed to be there, pregnant and working, while he lived surrounded by luxury? Guilt gnawed at him relentlessly, but he tried to smother it with deadlines, projects, and meetings. It was easier to hide behind work than to confront the emotions Evelyn had stirred within him. Claire noticed his distraction, and her frustration only added to the tension between them. She was perceptive enough to realize that Evelyn had left a mark on him that night. In a conversation that felt more like an accusation, Claire reminded Edward that the past couldn't compete with the future they were building. But for Edward, her words lacked weight. He knew his feelings ran deeper than fleeting nostalgia. Every corner of Edward's penthouse now seemed to remind him of the void he tried to ignore. He spent hours staring out the window, as if the city's skyline might offer some clarity. But all he saw were reflections of himself, a man surrounded by external success but stripped of any meaningful connection. Evelyn embodied what he had lost, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push that thought away. One night, he stumbled upon an old photo. It was from the day they had painted their first apartment together. Evelyn had paint smudged on her face, laughing at something he had said. In that moment, Edward felt a pang of regret so sharp it almost overwhelmed him. He closed his eyes and wondered if things might have been different had he prioritized love over ambition. But, as always, he dismissed the thought before it could take hold. Yet the image of Evelyn at the hotel haunted him. It was as if the universe was sending him a sign he couldn't decipher. Despite his efforts to move forward, the intensity of his emotions made it impossible. Avoidance was a habit Edward had perfected over the years, sidestepping direct confrontation with his feelings as though that made him stronger. But now, it felt like denial was no longer an option. Edward began avoiding social circles where he might cross paths with Evelyn again. He even delayed visits to the newly opened hotel, something entirely out of character for him. The truth was, he feared what might happen if their paths crossed again. He wasn't ready to face what she represented, the lies he told himself, the twists he chose to ignore, and the weight of a life built on superficiality. He kept insisting that time would resolve everything. But deep down, he knew time had never resolved anything. It only masked the cracks. Evelyn was one of those cracks, gaping, undeniable, and raw. And he was beginning to realize that ignoring her wouldn't be enough to mend it. Something had to give, but he still didn't know what. Despite his efforts to bury the past, Edward felt as though he was approaching a breaking point. It was as if his mind was split between two worlds, the controlled present and the chaotic past. And Evelyn, unintentionally, was pulling him deeper into the latter. He knew he couldn't run forever, but he wasn't ready to face what came next. Amid the storm of thoughts that wouldn't leave him in peace, Edward turned to the one person who always seemed to have the answers: Richard. His mentor, who had been his professor during college, had a gift for turning even the most complex situations into clear, actionable advice. Sitting in a quiet cafe, far from the glitz of grand openings, Edward poured out the story of seeing Evelyn and the confusion it had unleashed. Richard listened intently, not interrupting, his gaze steady as though he'd been expecting this moment. When Edward finished, Richard leaned forward, letting out a heavy sigh. "You know, don't you?" he said in his calm, measured tone. "It doesn't matter how many buildings you design or how much money you make, what holds it all up is the foundation of your life. And yours is crumbling." Edward stared at his coffee cup, as if it might hold the answers he sought. He knew Richard was right, but saying it aloud felt like admitting defeat. Richard didn't hold back. He talked about how Edward had always used his career as a shield, a way to protect himself from vulnerability. He reminded Edward of the nights they spent discussing projects in college, when Edward spoke of building something that would last forever. "You've lost sight of what really matters," Richard said firmly. "Evelyn was always the heart of everything you did, even when you didn't realize it. If you don't face this now, you'll lose the chance to become the man you've always wanted to be." Richard's words echoed in Edward's mind long after their conversation. Walking home, he wondered if he had the courage to admit his mistakes. It was easier to construct skyscrapers than to rebuild a broken bridge. But Richard was right. Evelyn wasn't just a shadow of the past. She was the key to understanding the emptiness he carried. In the days that followed, Edward revisited books Richard had recommended in the past. They were about architecture, but their lessons seemed eerily applicable to life. One passage read, "Before raising a structure, examine the ground. If it's unstable, everything will collapse." Edward realized his entire life had been built on unstable ground: pride, ambition, and the belief that success equaled happiness. Richard urged Edward to find clarity before making any moves. "You can't expect Evelyn to trust you just because you regret the past. She's built something on her own while you chose to step away. Regaining her trust will take more than words. It'll take action, consistency, and maybe even failure along the way." It was hard to hear, but Edward knew every word was true. As always, Richard offered a perspective Edward couldn't see on his own. "What do you want to build from here on out, Edward? Because if it's more of the same, it won't matter. But if it's something real, something that can stand the test of time, then it might be worth the risk." With that, Richard left Edward with a decision that felt larger than any project he'd ever designed. That night, as he stared at the blueprints for his next endeavor, Edward realized that no amount of grandeur in his designs could compensate for the lack of authenticity in his life. He couldn't rewrite the past, but perhaps he could reshape the future. The question was, would Evelyn give him that chance? And more importantly, did he deserve it? With Richard's voice still echoing in his mind, Edward felt a mix of fear and determination. He knew the next step would be more challenging than any professional competition or architectural feat. It was time to cross a threshold he had avoided for years. The question remained, was he ready for what came next? Edward spent days rehearsing what he would say to Evelyn. Every word felt inadequate to express the storm of emotions she had stirred within him. Finally, with his heart heavy, he decided to seek her out. He knew this wasn't a conversation that could be postponed forever. When he saw her again, at a small flower shop on the edge of town, she looked even stronger and more serene than on the night of the hotel opening. It was as if she had discovered a peace he had never known. Evelyn turned to face him, her expression a mix of surprise and caution. Her eyes, once filled with love for him, were now guarded. "What do you want, Edward?" she asked, her voice firm. The question was simple but layered with meanings he knew he'd have to untangle. He took a deep breath before replying, hesitant but determined. "We need to talk. About us. About the baby." The mention of the child was enough to break the ice, but not in a welcoming way. Evelyn crossed her arms and frowned. "Now you want to talk about this?" Her words hit like small punches, each one carrying the weight of years of pain and frustration. Edward hadn't expected warmth, but the disdain in her voice was harder to bear than he'd imagined. "You were always great at building things, Edward," she said sharply. "Too bad you could never hold on to what really mattered." He stood silent, absorbing the sting of her accusations. It wasn't just anger, it was hurt, disappointment. He knew Evelyn had every right to feel this way, but hearing it still cut deep. When Evelyn finally admitted that the baby was his, Edward felt a flood of emotions he couldn't name. Part of him was relieved. This was a connection to her that time and bad choices couldn't erase. But her admission came with a stark warning. "I don't trust you, Edward. And I don't want this child growing up with someone who disappears at the first sign of difficulty." Her voice was steady, resolute, and he knew she meant every word. He tried to argue, but the words felt empty in the face of her conviction. Evelyn didn't need him. She had found a strength he hadn't even realized she possessed. While he hid behind contracts and accolades, she had built something real and meaningful. He was starting to understand just how much he had missed by being absent. Still, Edward didn't back down. "I know I've failed you," he said quietly. "And I don't expect you to trust me again, Evelyn. But I want to be part of this child's life. I want to prove I can be better, for her and for you." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't care. The sincerity in his words was all he could offer. Evelyn shook her head, her skepticism clear. "Words mean nothing, Edward. Not anymore." The silence that followed was unbearable. Edward felt as though he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and the only way to cross it was to earn Evelyn's trust, something that would take time and effort. "Then give me a chance to show you, Evelyn." "Not now, but when you're ready." She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said more than words ever could. The battle wasn't won, but he had taken the first step. As Edward walked out of the shop, he felt a mix of defeat and determination. The conversation hadn't gone as he had hoped, but he also knew Evelyn had given him a small opening. Now it was up to him to prove his intentions were genuine, not just to her, but to himself. The question lingered, how do you rebuild trust when you've broken it so completely? Edward's decision was made. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he was ready to face each one. Evelyn had made it clear she wouldn't accept empty promises, and he had no intention of making any. Yet he also knew that winning her trust would require more than just persistence. It would mean confronting not only her doubts but also his own fears. The journey was only beginning. The days that followed their meeting were an emotional roller coaster for Edward. He was determined to win back Evelyn's trust, but every attempt seemed to hit an invisible wall. She remained distant, protected by layers of pain and caution. To make matters worse, Claire, his current partner, picked up on his change in behavior. "You seem obsessed with someone who chose to leave you behind, Edward." "Why?" Her sharp question stung, but Edward knew the answer ran deeper than she could understand. Meanwhile, Edward found allies in the most unexpected places, the small circle of friends Evelyn had made in town. At first, they treated him with distrust, almost disdain. But as they watched him persist in helping Evelyn without expecting anything in return, they began to soften. Their guarded advice and tentative support became invaluable as Edward navigated the delicate balance of proving himself while respecting Evelyn's boundaries. One of the greatest challenges Edward faced was confronting his own past. He began to see how his controlling behavior was rooted in the traumas of his childhood, a distant father and a rigid mother who had left scars he didn't even realize he carried. Therapy, something he had always dismissed as unnecessary, became a refuge where he could face these truths. Each session felt like a twist in his internal narrative, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. At the same time, Claire became an unexpected antagonist in his journey. She couldn't understand why Edward was so focused on Evelyn and the baby. To her, it felt like a threat to the comfortable life they had built together. Her demands for clarity increased, and Edward realized that staying in the relationship would only perpetuate a lie, for both of them. Ending things with Claire was painful but liberating, marking the close of a chapter that no longer fit his life. Evelyn remained cautious, but Edward pressed on. He began helping with small tasks, like carrying boxes or tending to the flowers when she needed a break. Though reluctant, she began to accept his help. For Edward, every little task was a victory, a brick in the bridge he was trying to rebuild between them. One pivotal moment came when Evelyn mentioned, almost offhandedly, the support group she had joined after moving to the town. "They helped me when I had no one else." "When you—" She paused, as if the words were too heavy to finish. Edward felt the weight of that sentence but also saw an opportunity. He decided to meet the people who had supported Evelyn, knowing that understanding her world was essential to being part of it. The support group meetings were humbling for Edward. Listening to stories of loss, resilience, and triumph gave him a perspective he hadn't had before. He also shared his own shortcomings, something he hadn't done in years. The vulnerability felt like a connection rather than a weakness, and it deepened his resolve to be better, not just for Evelyn and the baby, but for himself. Not all moments were triumphant. One evening, while helping Evelyn close the flower shop, Claire unexpectedly showed up. The tension was palpable, and Evelyn, already wary, saw this as another reason to keep her distance. Edward explained that he had ended things with Claire, but he knew his words alone weren't enough. Evelyn simply nodded, exhausted by the situation. Despite the setbacks, Edward pressed on. He knew rebuilding trust would take time and that Evelyn wasn't wrong to doubt him. But every skeptical glance, every hesitant acceptance of his help, was a reminder of why he couldn't give up. He was no longer just fighting for Evelyn's forgiveness. He was fighting to rebuild himself into someone worthy of it. It was on a cold, gray day that Evelyn handed Edward something he never expected: a notebook. It had been left behind in their old home, forgotten among moving boxes. It was a simple, worn object, but as Edward opened it, he felt like he was reading the most intimate chapters of a story he had ruined. The notebook was filled with Evelyn's thoughts, unsent letters, and reflections written during their years together. Edward spent hours flipping through the pages. Every word was a deep dive into the pain Evelyn had silently carried while he was consumed by his projects and ambitions. There were confessions of sleepless nights, pleas for attention he never heard, and even goodbye letters penned long before she actually left. "I always believed you could be more, Edward," one passage read, "but I realized you could only become that without me. Maybe I'm the anchor holding you back." He was devastated. The notebook was a mirror, showing him his worst flaws with brutal clarity. But amid the pain, there was something else: traces of hope. Evelyn hadn't destroyed the notebook or the memories it held. Even in her absence, she had preserved those pieces of their past. To Edward, it felt like a sign that, in some way, she still cared, not enough to trust him yet, but enough to share something so personal. With the notebook in his hands, Edward felt an overwhelming urge to do more than apologize. He began to write as well, responding to each letter with sincerity and remorse. It wasn't a gesture meant to impress Evelyn, but rather an exercise for himself, a way to confront how far he had strayed from the man he wanted to be. He didn't know if Evelyn would ever read his responses, but he needed to put them on paper. Evelyn watched from a distance, her stance still cautious. She didn't ask what Edward thought of the notebook, nor did she explain why she had given it to him. For her, it was a test. She wanted to see how he would react, whether he would engage with the memories or dismiss them as he often had. Seeing Edward so introspective, so silent, was new to her. But even then, she didn't let her guard down. Not yet. The days turned into weeks, and Edward couldn't let go of the notebook. He carried it with him, treating it like a constant reminder of his mission. During a casual conversation at the flower shop, he finally brought it up. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's response was sharp but revealing. "I didn't trust you. I just thought you needed to see it." Her words, though cutting, didn't discourage him. Edward understood that Evelyn wasn't ready to lower her defenses, but the fact that she had shared something so intimate was progress. He began to realize that earning her trust wouldn't come from grand gestures but from patience, consistency, and, above all, respect for her boundaries. Every page he read taught Edward more about the kind of love Evelyn deserved. It wasn't about grandiosity or hollow promises but about quiet actions that built trust day by day. As he tried to embody that understanding, he couldn't help but wonder if he would have enough time to prove he could change. The notebook was both a gift and a challenge, a reminder of what he had destroyed and what he still had the chance to rebuild. On the final page of the notebook, there was a note that seemed recent. Sometimes, foundations have to crumble for something new to be built. I hope, wherever you are, you understand that. Edward closed the notebook gently, as though handling something sacred. He knew this journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. The day Evelyn asked Edward to accompany her to an ultrasound appointment was unexpected. He could barely hide his surprise. The thought of being by her side during such an intimate moment seemed like a sign of progress, but it also thrust him into unfamiliar emotional territory. He knew this wasn't just about the baby, it was a chance to face his vulnerability and prove that he was present, fully and genuinely. At the hospital, as they waited in the quiet room, Edward couldn't take his eyes off Evelyn. Even pregnant and visibly tired, she radiated a strength that intimidated him. It felt as though he was seeing a version of her he had never known during their marriage. Independent, resilient, unshakable. He couldn't help but feel both proud and deeply ashamed for not being there to witness her growth earlier. He wondered if she could ever forgive him enough to let him share this new chapter. When the baby's image appeared on the screen, Edward was speechless. Time seemed to freeze as he stared at the tiny figure, still undefined but undeniably alive. His eyes filled with tears, and for once, he didn't try to hide them. Evelyn glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable, but in that moment he sensed a quiet acknowledgement of his emotions. It was a connection that transcended words, something raw and profoundly human. The doctor's voice described the baby's heartbeat and measurements, but Edward could barely hear it. He was overwhelmed by the reality unfolding before him. That small, fragile life represented a bond he had never experienced. He thought of his own childhood, of the absences and disappointments that shaped him, and silently vowed that this baby would not grow up with the same wounds. He would be there, no matter what it took. Evelyn remained stoic through most of the appointment, but the tension in the air was palpable. When they left the office, she offered a curt thank you and kept walking, as though the moment hadn't been monumental. For Edward, however, it was life-changing. He knew he had touched something essential, perhaps a flicker of hope, and he was determined not to let it fade. Later, on the drive home, Evelyn finally broke the silence. "You seemed emotional in there," she said, her tone almost indifferent. Edward didn't hesitate. "It was the most real moment I've had in years, Evelyn. Thank you for letting me be there." She didn't reply, but her expression softened slightly. For Edward, just being allowed to share that experience was a gift, even if it didn't mean Evelyn had fully accepted him. The ultrasound became a turning point for Edward. For the first time, he felt truly connected to something larger than his past mistakes or professional achievements. The idea of fatherhood no longer terrified him. It gave him purpose. But he knew that this newfound resolve had to be backed by consistent action. Evelyn had made it clear that words weren't enough. In the days that followed, Edward tread carefully. He offered support where he could, without overstepping Evelyn's boundaries. Every small conversation, every tiny gesture, felt like progress. Yet, Evelyn's walls remained firmly in place. Edward understood that she wasn't just testing his patience, she was testing his sincerity. And he was willing to face that challenge. The ultrasound had been a transformative experience, but it also underscored how much work lay ahead. Edward was prepared to face every obstacle, even without guarantees of success. For the first time in years, he wasn't fighting for accolades or recognition. He was fighting for the chance to be part of something real. The weeks leading up to the baby's arrival were filled with a mix of anticipation and quiet determination for Edward. He threw himself into helping Evelyn in small but meaningful ways, like organizing the nursery or running errands. At first, Evelyn accepted his efforts with visible reluctance, making it clear that he was on thin ice. But Edward didn't mind. For him, every little task was a chance to demonstrate his commitment, not with grand promises, but with quiet, steady actions. While painting the nursery walls, Edward found himself flooded with memories. He thought back to the first home he and Evelyn had shared, the laughter that filled those rooms, and the arguments that always ended in promises to do better. But he had broken so many of those promises. Now, holding a paintbrush, he felt like every stroke on the wall was an attempt to rebuild something, even though Evelyn wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. Gradually, their dynamic began to shift. Evelyn, while still cautious, allowed Edward to contribute to small decisions, like choosing furniture or folding baby clothes. It wasn't full acceptance, but to Edward, it felt monumental. He realized that these tiny moments of trust weren't just steps forward, they were the foundation of something new. Every box unpacked, every crib assembled, felt like a small victory. One afternoon, as they worked together to assemble the crib, Evelyn made a comment that took Edward by surprise. "I didn't think you'd be this good with your hands," she said, almost smiling. Edward chuckled awkwardly, caught off guard. It was a fleeting moment of levity, but to him, it was so much more. For Evelyn, it might have been a brief moment of normalcy, but for Edward, it was hope, something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. As the days went on, Evelyn began opening up in small but significant ways. She talked about her fears of raising a child on her own, the challenges of being both mother and provider. Edward listened carefully, without interrupting or offering solutions. He understood that his role wasn't to fix things but to be a supportive presence. These moments deepened his admiration for Evelyn, who embodied both strength and vulnerability in ways he hadn't fully appreciated before. Edward also began to integrate himself into Evelyn's world more naturally. He attended her support group meetings more regularly, connecting with others in the community. These interactions humbled him and gave him a broader perspective on resilience and human connection. Sharing his own flaws and missteps in these spaces wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Each meeting felt like a small step in becoming the kind of person he wanted to be. Even as their bond slowly strengthened, Evelyn remained guarded. She made it clear that while she appreciated Edward's help, it didn't mean she fully trusted him yet. For Edward, her caution was a reminder of the work still ahead. He wasn't discouraged. Instead, he took each cautious yes as a sign that he was moving in the right direction. Progress was slow, but it was steady. One evening, as they folded baby clothes together, Evelyn surprised Edward with a direct question. "Why are you really doing this, Edward? Is it guilt? Obligation? Or do you think you can just fix everything?" Edward took a deep breath before answering. "I'm doing this because, for the first time, I know I want to be someone this child can be proud of. Someone you might, someday, respect too." Evelyn didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. It was a start. These small moments of openness, though rare, fueled Edward's determination. He knew Evelyn wasn't ready to fully embrace him again, but her willingness to let him be part of this journey was enough. Each day spent with her and their unborn child brought him closer to the life he wanted to rebuild. The road was still long, but Edward was prepared to walk it one careful step at a time. As the baby's due date approached, Edward found himself more present than ever in Evelyn's life. He was no longer just helping with errands or tasks. He was becoming an active part of her daily routine. He joined her for doctor's appointments, stocked the nursery, and even prepared simple meals, something he had never done during their marriage. Each small act carried a weight of sincerity, a way of proving his commitment without saying a word. Evelyn, meanwhile, observed his actions with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. She still kept her emotional walls up, but she couldn't deny the consistency of his efforts. "You don't have to do all this, you know," she said one afternoon as he hung curtains in the baby's room. Edward smiled softly. "I know, but I want to." He understood that no single gesture would erase the past, but he hoped his persistence would show her that he was serious about the future. Edward also began to immerse himself in Evelyn's community. He attended local events and became a familiar face among her friends and support network. Initially, many were wary of him, knowing the pain he had caused Evelyn. But over time, his genuine efforts to help and connect began to win them over. He was no longer just Edward the architect. He was becoming someone who belonged in Evelyn's world. One defining moment came when Evelyn invited Edward to a parenting workshop hosted by her support group. She didn't say much about it, simply leaving a flyer on the counter. For Edward, it was a monumental step. It was her way of acknowledging his place in this new chapter, however tentative. During the workshop, he took notes diligently, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Evelyn. It was small, but it mattered. At the same time, Edward continued his journey of self-improvement. He committed to therapy, delving deeper into the root of his past behaviors. The sessions were painful but enlightening, helping him understand how his childhood shaped his need for control and validation. This process wasn't just about becoming a better father, it was about becoming a better person. Evelyn, though unaware of the specifics, began to sense these changes in his demeanor. Evelyn began to allow Edward to take on more responsibilities, like managing the baby's doctor visits or running errands independently. These small acts of trust were significant milestones for both of them. For Edward, it was proof that he was making progress. For Evelyn, it was an acknowledgement that she didn't have to do everything alone, even if she wasn't ready to fully rely on him yet. The dynamic between them began to shift subtly. There were moments of unexpected laughter, shared silences that felt comfortable rather than tense, and fleeting glimpses of the bond they once had. Evelyn still kept her guard up, but she allowed Edward to see glimpses of her softer side. For Edward, these moments were like tiny seeds of hope, showing him that their relationship, though fragile, wasn't beyond repair. As the baby's arrival loomed closer, Edward felt a mixture of excitement and fear. He knew the birth would be a pivotal moment, not just as a father but also as a partner to Evelyn. She allowed him to accompany her to the hospital when the time came, a gesture that Edward took as an immense act of trust. "Don't mess this up," she said firmly but with a flicker of vulnerability. He promised her he wouldn't. The night before the baby was born, Edward lay awake, reflecting on the journey so far. He knew the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but he felt ready. For the first time in years, he was certain of his purpose: to be a father, a partner, and a man who deserved the second chance he had been given. The day of the baby's birth arrived with an intensity Edward hadn't anticipated. He spent hours by Evelyn's side in the hospital, holding her hand as she endured the whirlwind of labor. The room was charged with tension and anticipation, and Edward knew this moment wasn't just about welcoming a new life, it was about proving that he could be there, fully and without hesitation. Evelyn, exhausted and vulnerable, let her guard down just enough for Edward to glimpse her strength in a new light. When the first cries of their baby filled the room, Edward felt his entire world shift. Tears streamed down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. Tiny and fragile, yet so full of life, she was a symbol of everything he needed to change. As he looked at Evelyn, who lay resting after the ordeal, he was overwhelmed with gratitude. This wasn't just about the baby, it was about the chance to be part of something greater than himself. Evelyn watched him from her hospital bed, her expression unreadable. There was a flicker of something, perhaps relief, perhaps acceptance, but she didn't say much. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. "She needs stability, Edward. Not promises." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. This wasn't about a single moment of joy, it was about proving, over time, that he could be the father and man they both deserved. The days in the hospital were a blur of sleepless nights and tender beginnings. Edward remained by Evelyn's side, helping with everything from diaper changes to soothing the baby's cries. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with accolades or success. One evening, as he rocked the baby to sleep, Evelyn observed him silently. She didn't say anything, but the slight softening of her features spoke volumes. When it was time to bring the baby home, Evelyn agreed to let Edward stay and help. It was a practical decision, but to Edward, it felt monumental. He threw himself into caring for both mother and child, from cooking meals to organizing the nursery. Every small act was a step toward showing Evelyn that he was serious about his transformation. He knew trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, but he was determined to earn it. Over the next few weeks, Edward and Evelyn found themselves navigating a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, Evelyn still held onto her caution, and Edward still had moments of doubt, but there were glimpses of a fragile partnership forming. One night, as they both sat by the crib watching their daughter sleep, Evelyn spoke quietly. "Maybe you really have changed, Edward. But I'm not sure if it's enough yet." Her words were measured, but for Edward, they were a lifeline. Edward continued his therapy sessions, delving deeper into the roots of his behavior. He began to understand how his childhood shaped his need for control and how those patterns had hurt Evelyn in the past. Each session felt like peeling back another layer of himself, revealing someone he hadn't fully known before. Evelyn noticed the changes, though she didn't always acknowledge them directly. The bond between them remained tenuous, but there were moments when it felt like the walls were starting to come down. Evelyn began to laugh more freely, sometimes even at Edward's awkward attempts to parent. These small moments of levity were like cracks in the armor she had built around herself. For Edward, they were signs of hope, proof that their relationship wasn't entirely lost. The baby's arrival marked not just the beginning of a new chapter but a resurrection for Edward. He wasn't just trying to win back Evelyn's trust, he was trying to rebuild himself into a man worthy of her and their child. Every night spent rocking his daughter to sleep, every small act of kindness toward Evelyn, was a step closer to the life he had once lost and now hoped to reclaim. In the months following the birth of his daughter, Edward's transformation became undeniable. He wasn't just present, he was deeply involved. From late-night feedings to soothing his baby's cries, Edward embraced fatherhood with a quiet determination. For the first time, he understood what it meant to prioritize something beyond himself. Each smile from his daughter, each coo and giggle, felt like a reward for his efforts, a reminder of why he couldn't falter. Evelyn, too, began to notice the changes. Though her trust in Edward remained guarded, she allowed him more space in their lives. She let him take charge of small but meaningful tasks, like taking the baby to her checkups or handling household chores. While she hadn't fully let her guard down, there was a noticeable shift. Edward had gone from being an outsider to someone she could begin to rely on. One evening, as they sat on the couch after putting the baby to bed, Evelyn finally broke the silence. "You've changed, Edward," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But I still don't know if it's enough." Her words were laced with vulnerability, and Edward knew this was her way of testing him. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight," he replied. "I just hope you'll give me the chance to show you, day by day, that I'm serious." The community around Evelyn also began to embrace Edward. Once skeptical, they now saw a man who was willing to put in the work, not for recognition, but because he genuinely cared. Edward continued attending support group meetings, sharing his journey openly. These sessions became a space of reflection and growth, helping him understand the importance of patience, empathy, and resilience. Evelyn started to involve Edward in moments she had previously guarded. She asked for his input on decisions about their daughter, shared her concerns about motherhood, and even laughed at his clumsy but sincere attempts to cook. These small gestures were significant. They signaled that, while Evelyn wasn't ready to fully forgive, she was beginning to see the man Edward was becoming. One afternoon, while they were in the garden, Evelyn turned to Edward and said something he'd been waiting to hear. "Maybe there's a chance for us. Not now, but someday." Edward felt his heart swell but kept his response measured. "I'll wait as long as it takes," he said, his voice steady. He knew this wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was enough to fuel his determination. The life Edward now lived was far from the one he had envisioned during his years of ambition and success. But it was infinitely more fulfilling. He had traded luxury for meaning, applause for connection. Every moment with Evelyn and their daughter was a reminder that the things worth fighting for weren't material. They were built on love, trust, and perseverance. Over time, Evelyn's walls began to crumble further. She let Edward into her world, piece by piece. While the wounds of their past would never fully disappear, they were learning to navigate a new relationship, one built on mutual respect and shared goals. For Edward, this was the greatest reward of all, the chance to be part of a family he had once taken for granted. Edward's return wasn't about erasing the past, it was about proving that he could build something stronger in its place. With each passing day, he became not just a father but a partner Evelyn could begin to trust again. And in that quiet, steady transformation, Edward found the life he had always been searching for, one defined not by grandeur but by genuine love and connection.